Welcome to Shawn's Thoughts. You're here with me, Shawn, with a W, and today we're joined with this Lego replication of a skull of perhaps a T-Rex, as the history books would have us believe. So there is a real good point that I've included this particular Lego thing within the frame of my picture. First of all, I kind of think it looks cool, especially with the backdrop of the two different types of white. But nonetheless, there is a further reason that I'd want to bring it into, well, what I'm going to talk about today. And that is right off the top, it's the topic of normalizing photonic life. Now, the first question that we would have is, what is photonic life, or what is it believed to be? And actually, there's a new TV series called Starfleet Academy, Star Trek, Starfleet Academy. And in it, there's a wide variety of newer characters from different parts of the Star Trek world. And there's one character in particular that I'm going to get into in a moment. Her name is S.A.M. And the series does a magnificent job of showcasing and highlighting her actual journey within the show. You see, in the show, Starfleet Academy, there's a series or a group of young cadets, we'll call them. Well, that's actually what they are. And they're all from different aspects and different walks of life who have come to join Starfleet and join the Academy in the rebirth after this magnificent or this chaotic event that basically crippled the entire alpha beta quadrants. And anyways, so needless to say, there are lots of different characters. There's a Klingon, and there's a Betazoid, and there's humans, of course, and then there's a whole bunch of other different beings. And essentially, they're all living together, and there's a lot more extraterrestrials brought to this series. And they essentially have their Starfleet Academy on Earth in San Francisco, just as the original series did. And anyways, so there's an introduction of a new character, and her name is S.A.M. Now, before we get into who S.A.M is, well, S.A.M is a photonic life being. And if you remember back from the original Star Treks, there was a doctor on Star Trek Voyager who also ended up being partially on, I think it was Discovery as well. So this particular doctor back in the Voyager days, well, when Voyager was on their mission, they lost their doctor. And so this doctor from Voyager was actually a hologram, and he was able to expand his reach while walking around the Voyager, by putting hollow emitters all over the ship. So it allowed him to move around more and therefore be the doctor, because they had had a battle and their real doctors and everything, they passed away. And so that was, in a sense, the introduction of that type of life, of a hologram, and that's how it was presented at that time. A hologram actually taking on the role of a life form, of a being who had dreams and aspirations and self-awareness and self-conscious, and essentially was able to interact with the crew of the ship as if he was a full-blooded being. And now we move ahead 20 some odd decades, 30 decades, and not 30 decades, 3 decades, and we come to this new show called Starfleet Academy, in which, as I said, there's a character. Her name is S.A.M. Now, she is right off the top photonic life. Like, that's how they brand her, or they explain what she is. And she comes from this planet called Kaz. And on Kaz, there are a lot of, we'll call them photonic beings, and they actually created this being named S.A.M. Now, this being a photonic life form, it looks, feels, acts in most cases as if it was a true human in what she's looking as. Like, the actual character in the TV show is an African black colored woman, heavy set, very jovial and happy. She's an amazing, positive character. And she is essentially on an exploration to decide whether or not for her people, like she's an emissary, and she's deciding whether or not her people are going to come back into living with what is termed by her organic life. So right away, the show in the beginning episodes essentially distinguish between what is organic life and what is photonic life. Now, to truly understand what photonic life is, especially how the show is presenting it, you definitely have to watch it. I think it's a really interesting show. It's a great spin on Star Trek if you're into that type of thing. And it definitely gives you the vibes of another show called The 100, I think it was called, and I forgot what it was called, but it gives you a teen vibe of Star Trek. And anyways, you can definitely see by the way that the show is presented that they are highlighting and showcasing. Like, this show has several different actors or different characters playing different roles within the cadet groups. And yet I'm watching the episode today, and this is the second or third one now that they've focused more on Sam and her journey. She's actually having to return back to her home planet in order to be repaired because she had experienced a trauma during one of the other episodes. But what the show is doing is it's truly showcasing what photonic life is. And as I've come to understand it, photonic life is simply what we would see as life overlaid over whatever it is that she is underneath. And what she is underneath actually is code and programming and light. She has one scene where she sticks her hand into the computer and is actually able to interact with the computer, like almost reprogram the computer by just putting her hand turns partially dissolving, like, anyways, it merges with one of the computer consoles in which she's able to then interact with it. Now, why I'm saying normalizing life is because I've come to understand it that this type of, we'll call it life, does exist. Maybe not the way that it's presented in Star Trek. However, the idea of a life form or something that's a holographic projection having an understanding or a belief that it itself is independent of whatever it is, that it is sovereign. Like, there was once upon a time, I guess around a decade ago, when people were talking about how the characters in the game Sims would actually one day become self-aware and like they would have a knowledge of the self. And then essentially at that point, perhaps people hypothesized that that's when life is when it becomes self-aware. It realizes who it is, as opposed to, whatever it was before. So we often have times where a lot of the movies or TV shows that we watch, they'll often essentially contribute to predictive programming or to showing us what perhaps life actually is, but showing it us as a TV show so that when it does happen, we have some sort of reference point to it. There's been many TV shows that have actually truly contributed to my own personal programming growing up. And I'm going to be doing episodes where I completely talk about lots of different things in movies like The Matrix, of course, another movie called Jupiter Ascending, and another one called The Truman Show, because these movies, these entertainments, actually have a lot of valuable insights and cognitions and knowledge and wisdom all compacted into a nicely, I don't know, packaged 2-hour experience. And so this particular show, Star Trek, I can definitely see how they are normalizing what we and how we understand life and what life is and our reflections upon it. The entire journey of this character is so well crafted, to humanizing her, to giving her traits that we are ecstatic and excited about, to having other characters speak highly positive about her, while other characters are going through traumas and issues, and there's moments where we dislike those characters because of their actions. This particular character is always on the positive, high-spirited part. So I can definitely see or foresee this being more of a gentle guideway into understanding what these photonic life beings are. And now, as I was mentioning before, I've come to the understanding that this type of being does exist in the sense that things in our world have overlays. An overlay is simply a program put up around another being, perhaps. And I've often mentioned overlays kind of be like being what you would see in a Lego video game, where during the game you have your game that you play, and then you get rewarded by these red bricks, and they're able to add on or toggle switch overlays to essentially be on everything in the world. So, for example, you can see overlays as being when you look at your world is your world, but at Christmas time, all of the decorations get put on everything, the lights get put on everything. It's still the same window or still the same tree, but then they start putting decorations and lights and all of that lovely stuff all over everything, and that could be seen as an overlay. And that's exactly what happens in the Lego game, is when you toggle a switch, suddenly everything is Christmas like, or it's Halloween like, or whatever overlays that they've put, but it's an entire program which is overlaid over top of the base reality already. And that's how I've come to understand overlays. And the other idea which was put forth by Kim. And now remember, before I go into continuing talking about this, I want to point out something. This whole Sean's Thoughts podcast has simply been about me sharing my exploration, meaning that I'm not necessarily telling you what is true and what's not true. It's how I've come to understand the information which I'm gathering. And the GIA reports and Kim Gogan have put forth a lot of fantastic and incredible information. And so part of this whole Sean's Thoughts process is for me to essentially, as I speak out into the world, my voice, I hear myself. So I'm also obviously listening to myself, but I'm also essentially contemplating all of these ideas, because part of reality is our co-creative participation within that reality creation. And often and I say they, meaning the people who ran the Matrix or perhaps were aware of the actual power of the Matrix, they would essentially get us to co create aspects of life that weren't necessarily for our benefit. They did things through predictive programming and other means in order to, you know, influence us heavily in order to create the realities which they would prefer. Putting out a news broadcast about something happening in another part of the world, and then 10 million people sit in coffee shops and talk about it, unknowingly, actually, that they are creating that event to perhaps move forward to a higher degree. So, what I've come to understand is that there are perhaps beings in our world that are photonic life, that are beings that have had overlays put on top of them. Now, what's underneath, we'll leave that for something else. But the point being is that, and why I brought up this T-Rex skull right now, is because overlays essentially are aspects which are laid on top. They're programs, and they can be psychological programs, for example. And when they are overlaid on top, they essentially provide us with a different narrative or a different perspective of what we're seeing. And that's kind of what I brought this dinosaur originally. I had the idea of, well, what they found in the dirt was this big skull. And then the overlay that they put on top of it, that society or people, artists especially, put on top of it, was the color of the skin, was the color of the eyes, was all of that other external stuff, meaning that what we see in our reality is simply the fossils. And then the overlay is the construction or orientation of the construction of the fossils, the missing pieces, such as perhaps the wings, and all of the other things that are on top. So the skin color, the actual skin, the roughness of the skin, all of the different creative aspects to help us better see beyond just the skeletons. Those, in a sense, are all overlays. Now, we accept them. We see, okay, well, it must have been a reptile, and sometimes we're thinking that one day. And then I went to a museum the other day, and not the other day, like a year ago, and they were telling me that the T-Rex was actually a descendant of the chicken. And there's a lot of different perspectives, but nonetheless, all of these things are a great example of an overlay, because they are what someone has creatively decided was actually seen on the outside. And so we get back to photonic beings. Well, are there beings that on our planet that walk around with us, that inside are code like Sam from the Star Trek show? Are they acting exactly like us? Do they bleed? Do they love? Do they feel? Like in the show, for example, the character Sam has all of the attributes and characteristics of a young teenage girl. She's photonic life, meaning that she's quite new, in a sense that she was recently created by her creators on a planet called Kaz, and yet she's participating in the world from the perspective of a teenage girl, with all of the programs that a normal teenage girl might have, the fear of this and the aspirations of that, and she wants to fall in love, and she wants to experience life, and she feels pain, and she's there for her friends, and she makes her mistakes, and she's a very ambitious person, and she has her mission up to essentially decide, or help her people decide, whether or not they want to come back and live with organic life. So already out there in the TV shows, we are definitely seeing a more magnificent push to, and I say magnificent not in a positive way and not in a negative way, it just means a very strong push, a magnificent, like a mountain, for example, push, a mountainous push towards integration and a better understanding of AI. I've often talked about how AI may have been here considerably longer than we ever imagined. And I underline that, longer than we ever imagined. And I made a show, or a possibilities series, not series, but episode from my series, called Did God Create AI? Because it's come to my attention through considerable amount of research that, as I said before, AI has been here for considerably longer than computers have been publicly known. They say that computers came out in the public in 1974, and yet there's a lot of evidence showing that computers predated that by perhaps a lot longer. And we won't get into that, because this is more so about that idea of predictive programming, normalizing what we see as normal. And they've often used, as I've mentioned before, TV shows and movies to try to essentially teach us what they want us to create reality. In the past, I once mentioned there was the World Fair in Chicago, and in a time when technology wasn't in everyone's pockets, they had to essentially bring people to world fairs in order to show them what living life was all about. Now you just simply need to create a show on a streaming service, and people get an idea of how to respond or how to become aware of what's happening in the world. And so predictive program can definitely be an asset when you're trying to essentially bring everyone up to some equal footing for how we live life and how we perhaps treat and respect one another. And yet at the same time, it can essentially slip in ideas and cognitive programming to get us to essentially begin to accept perhaps the narrative that they're wanting us to accept. And so, yeah, I would definitely recommend that, you go off, and perhaps if you're interested in Star Trek world, this is a great series. But even if you've never watched Star Trek before, this is such a unique take on it. And seeing this character interact with everyone else in the world, and then when you have a larger understanding of the world that we live in, and the world that we live in is truly unlike anything the history books have ever had within it. things are being disclosed, discovered, understood better, clarified. A lot of the, we'll call it, so-called conspiracy theories of the past are turning into actual, concrete disclosures now that are being or running rampant throughout our news stream media. And I won't get into any of those specifically, but definitely this show does play a part in the conscious evolution and awakening of us, of the Homo sapiens, of the true nature of our reality. And essentially that's what Sean's Thoughts podcast is all about, is me and my journey to essentially find the truth. As a truth seeker myself, I I deserve to know, I'm inclined to investigate any and all truths. And, a lot of them may not turn out to be true. However, that's kind of irrelevant to me because me being a storyteller, I love hearing possibilities. That was the whole idea behind my series, Possibilities, was to explore possibilities. Actually, I was going to put this one in that possibility series. However, I'm looking at perhaps doing it slightly different. And yeah, that one I'll discuss later. My plan is, well, no, I'm not gonna out my plan yet for that one. But anyways, so it's all a possibility. Everything that I speak about is a possibility. There's something called the Teachability Index, amazing reference point that I found that one could essentially self-reflect on themselves. And the idea is when you have a high teachability index, it means that you are teachable, that you are open and willing to learn. And there's two parts to the teachability index as explained to me. One of them is your ability to change, and the other one is your desire to learn. And those two markers, or those two gauges on a scale of 1 to 10, when multiplied, they essentially show you how high is your teachability. And if you imagine the numbers, say for instance, you were 5 on the desire or the ability to change, and then you were 5 on, your ability to learn. Or anyways, if you're 5 on either side, when you multiply them, you get 25. However, if you're 10 on either side, you multiply them, you're 100. And so you can see that there's an exponential growth pattern in there, but there's also an exponential limitation in there. For instance, if you have 10 on one side, but on one side you have a 1 or a 2, it doesn't matter how much on the other side you have. For instance, if you have, you really want to, learn, but you're not willing to change. So no matter how much you learn, if you're not willing to change and you're stuck in your ways, your teachability index remains low consistently. You have to, not have to, but you ought to be high on both. So when you multiply a 9 by a 9, for example, you get 81. But if you have a 9 or a 10 on one side and you got a 2 or 3 on the other side, well, you're going to get around 30. And it's a really amazing tool in order to self-reflect and look at yourself. Are you willing to change? And are you willing to learn? Because essentially it requires both. And that's essentially what my whole idea of this whole podcast was, is to explore these ideas, not to decide whether they're true or not, because until something manifests or is realized within my reality, it's still a hypothesis, it's a theory, it's a possibility. It's important to recognize that truth isn't truth until truth is standing in front of you. And then it remains to be seen of, what that truth's going to do anyways. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your attention and your support and all those other lovely things. I truly, 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 I have to underline that word again, appreciate all of your attention and your support, your comments, the views, the likes, all of it. I definitely enjoy all of the comments, as I've mentioned many, many times before. See, I believe we're moving into a brand new reality, and together we're going to witness, experience, and see many, many more things than the news media is telling us right now. And this stuff is going to knock your socks off. So come journey with me, subscribe, like, comment, whatever, you know, let me know you're there and come take this journey with me. So thank you so much for sharing your time with me, and ask yourself one thing. Could this Lego dinosaur have had wings that perhaps weren't put on when you walked into the museum to look at them? Could it perhaps be the missing link that we hear all of these stories about dragons flying through our world, and yet dragons are a myth, we're told, and yet these dinosaur bones that they only found in the 1850s somehow are them? Perhaps, maybe, who knows? Let's discuss that possibility later. And I look forward to seeing you in any numerous amounts of the videos that I'm about to put out. Please check out this Do No Thing video. Take a moment to reflect and spend 3 minutes doing no thing with me. I'm going to put it right here at the end. Have a wonderful day.